Hello, Internet. Tonight we're going to be talking about Docker and Swarm and orchestration and everything you can put in a container and swear, but I do this every week now, lately, and as long as people keep showing up, and maybe if they don't, I'll be right here. And so this week we're doing it late night Docker style, so it's evening East Coast US, so after working hours, maybe some new people can show up and ask questions. So feel free to throw in the chat your questions. We'll get them all lined up. I'll spend probably an hour going through the details of your answers and maybe even do some real stuff in the command line. If we get to that point, depending on your questions, we can browse the internet together and figure out to answer your problems. And really anything DevOps, anything sysadmin or developer related that is related to getting code out of your machine and onto a server for other people to use. Anything in the middle there is fair game. And this is all based around my courses. I do several different courses. You can see those in the description. There's a link on this video to my website, brettfisher.com. And on there is going to be most of the resources that people end up talking about, like how do I get started in Node.js on Docker? How do I do PHP in Docker? How do I create a 3-node cluster with orchestration? You know, all those kind of common questions. How do I monitor it? How do I log it? How do I alert on it? How do I test it? That kind of stuff. A lot of that stuff's in there, and I also have an offline sort of AMA, not live, on GitHub that's also in there as well. So you can ask questions later, and I answer them on GitHub in a GitHub issues format. So we're going to get started with a bunch of questions here in a few minutes, and I just want to sort of catch you up with what's been going on lately and the world of Docker and containers. Now that you're early and on time to this live YouTube, you get the advantage of sort of getting some news. But first, before we talk about that news, maybe we should shift over to the browser. So let's go to the internet. Okay, so hopefully my mic's working. We had a problem with that a couple weeks ago where it didn't always work like I'd hoped. So if it's not, jump out in chat and let me know. Otherwise, I'm going to assume it's all working. It looks like the level here is great. So a couple weeks ago, I did an update on my website and moved from playing around with it. But a lot of the stuff that I do here is actually in a repo, in case you're curious, over at dog versus cat. So this is a part of my DockerCon talk, which is about how maybe a small team or even a solo DevOps person can take a Docker cluster and put it into production using Docker Swarm and have a redundant hardware, networking, and container orchestration system with really very little effort and maintenance on your part. And a lot of that is in this repo, along with some documentation, including the DockerCon video. I'll be doing that again at DockerCon EU in November. But before that, in case you are in the New York area or London, I will actually be doing 2-day Docker workshops, which are more information than is in my courses. So if you take any of my courses, you know that there's lots of info in those courses about everything from how to use Docker, how to use Compose, how to use Swarm. And I've got coming up some 2-day workshops in September. I list all the places that I'm speaking in public. I encourage you to come and hang out, and we will high five and take a selfie, put it on the internet, and have some fun and talk about DevOps and Docker. So those are going to be my upcoming 2-day workshops at those events. And then November, if you're around the Copenhagen area, I'm going to be at GoTo conference for a full-day Swarm workshop there. And then obviously at DockerCon in Barcelona in December. And that will wrap up the year. So I encourage you to come out. I'd love to meet people that are fans of Docker, especially someone who's maybe seen me on the internet, and then we get to finally meet in person instead of chatting in text, and that's always a lot of fun. So I put a blog article out a couple weeks ago that got a lot of talk around the future of Docker Swarm. So if you haven't seen that, if you're at all interested in orchestration, even if you're a fan of Kubernetes and you're just curious about what's going on in some of the other orchestrators, This is a post that I basically was at Docker headquarters, and I got to interview one of the Swarm team members. So this is an article that's in 3 parts. It's a description about what's gone on. It's a video interview that's about 10 minutes long at Docker headquarters with the Swarm team. That's me and Anshul. And then down here at the bottom, I go through this exhaustive list of all of at least everything I could find that's major, what features might have been added. And so if you're at all interested in Swarm, you haven't probably seen a lot come out of Docker on their blog this year. So I tried to catch us all up with what's really been happening in the code and in the features there. So I do encourage you to check that out. So that is kind of the major thing that I was working on. Now what's happening is coming up soon is my release of a whole new course called Docker for Node.js. And what that's going to be is if you're at all involved with Node.js development, this is going to be a shorter course, but at least probably 4 to 5 hours, I'm guessing, of helping you learn all the ins and outs of how to get the most out of Docker if you're a Node.js developer. So that's going to teach you all the local compose stuff and exactly how to get the super sweet setup where everything's running in a container. There's Vim. If you're like me, like a Vim fan, you got your debugger running, you've got your code mounted, you're running npm in the container. Basically you don't even have to have Node running on your Windows or Mac. And so it'll be designed around Windows, Mac, and Linux, getting you all set up there. And then how do you test it? How do you test it with a MongoDB? How do you make sure that things are starting up in the right order? How do you make sure that connections are handled during downtime in terms of shifting from one container to another for production? And then finally, that course will talk about production and how you deal with connection rollovers, rolling updates, monitoring, that sort of stuff inside a container for Node.js. So I'm excited about that course. If you're interested at all in that course, jump over to my website. You can get on my newsletter, and I'll be announcing it there shortly with a big old coupon to get that course super cheap. So that's enough about that. We've got a couple of questions of people piling up, so I will get to those, and hopefully we'll dive into some fun stuff. So first, I'm going to say that I'm apologizing for some of the names. I may mispronounce your name, but I try to say hi to everyone that says hi to me in chat, and we can reach across the internet, give each other a high five, maybe a fist bump if you're a fist bumper, and let's try to solve some of your problems. So we got Joris saying hello. We've got Sean just saying he's hanging out to absorb. Kevin Griffin, which is a good friend of mine, is saying YOLO. And if I don't know if that translates to other cultures. That's you only live once. I guess that means on the internet you live forever, though. So definitely more than once. Gavin is saying what's up, and he's saying what's the best. Okay, so first question. What is the best way to deal with Nginx on the Swarm and real IPs? Should we use the network type of host? That depends, Gavin. I try to not use host because host requires more work. I'd rather use the built-in Swarm ingress networking, the routing mesh. And the only time that I ever see anyone needing to go to host is if they need absolute top-line performance. That's usually people that are dealing with 10 gigabit networking and they need extremely low latency, so they want to remove any of the potential ingress stuff, and they want to get direct access to the host NIC. Because the minute you put a container on the host network, you're now giving it direct access to the host NIC and full control of that, so it's a higher risk for security purposes. Not a huge deal if you're really just dealing with a proxy, but Nginx does have bugs, so there's the potential there that if they get in that container and get into Nginx, then they could have complete control over the NIC. So I try not to do that. The other big reason is people need the real client IPs to come from their client. They need to know what that client IP is. That's not that. Yeah, it says it's excellent. Okay, so I'm going to keep talking. You never know on the internet. So you need to get the real IP. So that means, yes, you're going to use host if you're talking about in the cloud. Then you are going to need to do the host mode. You can do Mac VLAN, which is another driver, but host is probably going to be the solution for you. There's documentation on this out there on various ways that people have set up. I wouldn't probably use, if you're going to use Nginx, I probably wouldn't use just raw Nginx. I would use Nginx in a way that it's Swarm aware. so it can then route your traffic around. Maybe you're already familiar with that and that's not what you're asking. But if you absolutely have to have the IPs and you don't have something else in front of your cluster, because usually you do, right? Usually you have something in front of a multi-node cluster that is handling from a single IP the connections coming in, and that's usually doing that. So that thing is going to probably be capturing the IPs, not your nodes. But in your case, if you are, then host is probably the only option you have there. Hope that answers your question. Again, if any of these questions, if you have further questions on that, just throw them in chat and I'll get to them as we get to them. All right, Antonio, how to choose between Kubernetes and Swarm orchestration. I would say I always urge people to start with Swarm when they're learning the concepts of orchestration, simply because you can learn Swarm in an afternoon, right? I mean, most of my Swarm course, the sort of the core functionality of Swarm and the problems it solves are the same thing that Kubernetes solves. And you can learn them because there's less moving pieces in Swarm, so you can learn those in an afternoon. With Kubernetes, you end up usually with people talking at first when they're learning it just about how to just even set it up, and that ends up into a half day or a full day conversation about just getting it set up. Where in Swarm, rather, that's usually a 5-minute conversation because it's a couple of commands. But I would say the biggest factor on whether you should choose one orchestrator over another is based on your team expertise, your OS requirements, and the size of your team, not necessarily related to a feature. Because each solution out there is probably going to have a solution at this point because they're both multiple years old. They're going to have a solution for whatever your problem is. One may do one solution better than another in your eyes, but they're all going to have, they're all being used in enterprises. They're all being used by startups. They're all being used by small teams. The thing about Kubernetes that I usually caution people about is that if you don't need the complexity of Kubernetes, and especially if you don't need the complexity of building it yourself, then don't. Because at the end of the day, unless your full-time job is just to be a sysadmin and run a container cluster, you don't want to be doing this all day. This is another tool in your tool bag, and you've probably got lots of other things you got to get done. So I usually, if I was training a team, if a team was consulting with me and saying, we know Docker, but we want to now do production clusters, and we do Node.js, PHP, we have some MySQL, we have some Redis, and or whatever, and we got some .NET support. I believe is still in beta. Swarm support is in production. It's been working now for a year at least. So the Docker engine at least, and I believe the only way that you can get today Kubernetes running with a stable supported lifecycle on Windows, for example, is to do it with Docker Enterprise Edition, which works directly with the Microsoft team to make sure that works. So there's some weird stuff there, right? I mean, if you don't care about Windows and you are a solo person, then I would almost always say use Swarm. If you need to use some specific functionality that you can only get in Kubernetes, which a lot of times there's usually a solution either way, I would say use the cloud provider of your choice, use their Kubernetes deployment infrastructure. That way you're not in charge of building it, keeping it secure and locked down and safe. Because I think the complexity of just building out all of the infrastructure, and then you start talking Kubernetes and Helm and your networking provider of choice and your storage provider of choice, and you get all these things in there, and pretty quickly you end up like Tesla, which was a company that got their Kubernetes hacked because they simply didn't secure it properly. Kubernetes as the sort of the enterprise, when you have a team of 3 people dedicated to managing this whole infrastructure, then that's maybe where I would say, yes, you should be building it yourself. If you're on VMware in a data center, then maybe you can handle it at that level. But there's a lot more work and involvement with building and managing a Kubernetes cluster. So I get concerned when solo people come to me and say, should I do one or the other? Because there's a lot of time involved in managing the infrastructure of a Kubernetes production system. So I'm a big fan of having other people do it for you, just like with databases. If you got databases on Amazon, have them run them, right? If they have RDS, if you're on Amazon or Azure or DigitalOcean or whatever provider, see if you can get someone else to run your databases. Usually they are better at it than we are, right? So I feel that same way about orchestration, is that we're not usually the biggest experts in it, so maybe consider using someone else's. Great question, though. I get that all the time. And there's actually, if you go to my AMA in GitHub, there's a Kubernetes topic there where I try to talk about the different things you need to consider, different options you need to consider. So this is under brettfisher.com/AMA. And I go into some of the thoughts, more details, more bullet points. It may inadvertently sound like it's down on Kubernetes. That's mostly due to the fact that I feel like the internet's doing a really, really good job of educating us all on Kubernetes and all the awesome positives of it. I feel like the internet is not always doing us a great service on explaining the complexities and the hidden problems with it. That can also be said with Swarm, right? Swarm is not perfect. No orchestrator is, no tool is. But I feel like I should do the due diligence with people and make sure that, hey, do you even need that? Do you need that high complexity solution when you maybe could use something even simple, much more simple and easier to use? Hope that helps you make your decision. In general, a friend of mine who's another consultant said, if the team is less than 3 full-time DevOps people, they should not build their own Kubernetes. They should use someone else's Kubernetes. Just because it's a lot of work to keep it secure and locked down if you just use raw Kubernetes. Gavin, you're welcome. Suso, do you have any Kubernetes course? No, I am in the works of something on Kubernetes right now. No release date planned, but I want it to be different, right? I want it to be something where you're not just learning the fundamentals of Kubernetes and like the basic primitives and objects and things that are involved with it, but also helps you make decisions on how you should choose to deploy your Kubernetes. There are lots of variants of Kubernetes. In the orchestrator game, there's one Nomad, there's one Mesosphere, really, there's one Swarm. But when it comes to Kubernetes, there are lots of types of different Kubernetes. There's Docker Enterprise Edition, there's Rancher, there's Amazon, there's Azure, and they all choose different parts and different pieces differently, and they function differently. So it gets a little convoluted and difficult for new people to figure out, okay, what's the right path for me? What decisions should I make just so that I can get there? And I got to figure out a way to help you figure that out. So sign up for my newsletter. That's at brettfisher.com. I think you just go to the top of the page, and that newsletter there's a little button for newsletter. Tiny, tiny, tiny button that will tell you, I'll announce to that newsletter when those courses are launched. Moving from hosting 250 websites, this is Biker 2010. Moving from hosting 250 websites, over 10 traditional LAMP and .NET servers, I want to containerize and have prototyped a few sites, cool, on a 3-node swarm, get great performance on website as a stack. Let's see. But okay, it looks like you have a multi-part question. But that is with a separate Apache server per container database as a connection to a managed DB service, not in a container. Host concerned about the memory impact. Is that the right way to go? Or should Apache be a single service? And how do I do that with containers given the configuration in a classic? This is a long question. You're giving me a hard one, Biker, right up front. All right. Containers in a classic mode with the confd files. Do I have to add a file in the single Apache container and restart for each website? That doesn't seem correct. I don't know about your original setup, but it seems like what you're asking is, should you be running each website in its own Apache server? I would assume, without knowing like all the ins and outs, my default answer is going to be yes, a website per container. If you are obviously, Apache servers have the capacity to run lots of websites. But generally in containers, if we start running a whole lot of things in a single container, even if it's multi-Apache websites, assuming those are in different pipelines of deployment and managed by different people, and it's not just one person doing all that work, you're now talking about a continuous integration and deployment path that's different for each one of those, and you want to be able to control the updating and replacement of those differently. So I would argue that it's probably, if you're doing container orchestration and you have that level of container automation, you should be doing each one of these in their own container. And so you might have one web app in its own repo, I'm not sure if you're a hoster, if you're trying to do that for other people. That doing hosting where you're providing other people access to your containers and that level, that's well beyond what I could probably describe in this video, because that is that's more of a containers as a service solution, and that's a whole different ball of wax. But I would say, yeah, if you're on a 3-node swarm and it's working and you're putting them in multiple containers, do that. You are going to have more resource utilization, memory in terms of the fact that you're running all these different Apaches, but you're also going to be able to scale it up and down, right? That's the idea of orchestration, is you scale up and down. So you hopefully would maybe save costs there, or at least be able to deploy easier and not have to worry about breaking Apache. The thing about running Apache in multiple containers is if you break it accidentally on one, you didn't touch the other ones. You didn't affect the other ones. But if you break Apache and it's running 250 web, a little bit of what you needed there. You could say the same thing about a lot of other products, right? A lot of database applications can run lots and lots of databases. So the question in containers that is really very different for each person is, do I run every app in their own database, or do I run a big single database server and then run a lot of databases in that server? And that depends on a lot of factors, like how good is your team at running databases? How big of an infrastructure is it? Is it more performant, faster for you to just run those separately in different databases? So I would say in your case, it sounds very bespoke that you have that many websites that you're considering running on one Apache. But if it was me, I'd split all those containers out. Hope that answers the question. All right. John Kennedy, in this case, how hard is it to migrate from Swarm to Kubernetes? I would say it is not hard, and it depends on what you're talking about, infrastructure or app. Moving an app in an app infrastructure from one orchestrator to another in level of difficulty is probably easier than hand building your own Swarm and then hand building your own Kubernetes and trying to migrate those infrastructures. The app itself, right? So your apps are going to be using YAML files in either case. And so, especially with something like Docker Enterprise Edition that focuses on the developer production workflow, you're going to be able to use those same compose files that you built on Swarm in Kubernetes if you choose to do the Docker EE route. Most other tooling doesn't offer that. So then you have to come up with the things that people run locally as developers, and the things that they run in production on the servers, and those two things are different. We don't have a lot of answers in the industry. On the Kubernetes side, Helm seems to be the application file description tool that is being used by a lot of the community, and is being adopted by the CNCF. The nice thing is that, but that tool, however, doesn't work necessarily locally unless you're someone who wants to set up Kubernetes on your laptop. And then it gets into this whole world of like, I thought we were trying to get away from that with containers and not have to build server infrastructure on our local machine just to develop apps, right? So then a lot of teams end up with Compose for development and Helm for production. There's lots of tools to help you with that. So it does get a little tricky. I would say that the concepts of Swarm and the concepts of Kubernetes at a very high level are the same. They do the same. They solve the same problem. What standards you use for each orchestrator and how you describe your apps in those orchestration systems, and then how you decide to use those between the two is going to be different. I'd say the only one that I've seen with a smooth path between the two is Docker Enterprise Edition. I don't think anyone else is really, that I'm aware of, unless there's some open source projects I just don't know about, which is highly possible because there's new open source projects all the time, especially for Kubernetes. I don't really see a lot of people solving that problem of smoothing out people developing locally with a Docker engine and then running that same exact thing as close to that as possible in production without two sets of separate files, unless they're telling the developers to run Kubernetes locally. Anyway, that's a really detailed answer to that question. I'm probably not the best person to answer that question, so I may not have the best answer for that one. I have not had any clients migrate from Swarm to Kubernetes. So they either are one or the other, or they just have both, and they don't necessarily migrate. So I don't have really much experience with that. Let's see. Yes, that is built into Docker Engine. It does not necessarily work on orchestration, but if you're at the Docker command line, you will see up here, you have a bunch of options. So you have checkpoints, all right? Don't talk about those a lot, but that's a thing. And depending on if you're worried about saving the state of a running container and just storing the files, or if you're really talking about like the memory and storing the memory, that's what checkpoints are for. If you use import and export and save and load, you'll notice down here, like you actually have Docker save, commands like that, that will save an image out. If you're in Docker container commit, that is a command that takes a container and makes an image of it. So there's that. So yeah, there's a bunch of options built in. It just depends on exactly what you're wanting to do with it. So check it out. And all that works on Docker run. Certain parts of that don't work in like Swarm or Kubernetes. It's just a question of, you're talking about locally with Docker run. Alex Ria, what's up? I thought I saw you in there earlier. I don't know if you're still on or not, because I think I'm a little bit behind on the chat, but how are you doing? It's been a while. What was the best practices for handling autoscaling in Swarm? Also, props on your video production setup. Thank you. I like my video production setup. I work on it a lot. It is fun. I geek out on this stuff here. So in case you have any questions, throw those in Slack. But yeah, Swarm autoscaling. Yeah, not the best thing in the world out there. So there's nothing built in, right? You probably know that. And the rest of you may not know that. But Kubernetes has answers for that problem. Swarm, I personally was kind of hoping that a project from Docker called Infrakit was going to be built in. Let me see here. Infrakit, this was a cool project that Docker built that was basically like Terraform, but it used Swarm's Raft database, kind of like etcd database, to store the configuration and would speak to cloud engines. And so it could talk to AWS, talk to Azure, and actually handle nodes up and down, stuff like that. So it is not dead, but it has kind of stalled a little bit just due to some reorganizing on the Docker team, and it hasn't made its way yet into the Docker tooling. So it does work, but it's a separate tool, and it's not super user-friendly yet. But it has the potential to do autoscaling when combined with something that monitors. So in Swarm, you really need two pieces of the puzzle to do autoscaling at either level, either at the container level or at the node level. You need something to monitor performance, because I'm assuming that's what you want to do, right, is autoscaling for performance reasons. So you need something to monitor that performance, like Prometheus, and then you need something to take action based on that and do that inside a Swarm. So I have seen examples of people taking Prometheus, and they set up alerting with a Prometheus add-on for alerting that will simply run a Docker Swarm command or an AWS command to spin up new instances. It could possibly connect to a Lambda that could do that. But I don't recall off the top of my head if there is a single repo that creates a command line tool to just do all that for you, right? Because it needs to be, because usually people are asking me about autoscaling. They are talking about both infrastructure node autoscaling and autoscaling of a service. So in AWS, recreation of nodes is automatic with AWS's feature set of Elastic. I'm spacing out on exactly the terminology. In EC2, right? So you can have nodes replaced automatically with a group in there, ASGs, autoscaling groups. And then in Swarm, obviously, any failed thing that fails a health check is going to come up as a new replica. So the key is if you want to scale up and down based on performance metrics, and all the examples I've seen that are pure open source are using Prometheus to simply kick off a Docker command to either increase or reduce the replica count, or setting off an ASG in scale up or scale down of nodes. It's not that hard in Swarm. The nice thing is adding nodes to Swarm is super easy. So a lot of times the scripts and examples I've seen aren't that, just a couple of lines of Swarm commands, basically. It doesn't require a lot of work to have an EC2 instance added. It's usually just a couple of lines, one line to install Docker, one line to add it to the swarm, that sort of thing. So best practices on auto scaling is really just get it to work. The people that, and in fact, I don't even think Docker Enterprise Edition does auto scaling for performance yet on Swarm. I could be wrong, but I'm pretty sure it doesn't. Excellent question. You asked a good one, and I don't have a video for that. I need to make like a sample setup of Prometheus with some AWS scripts or something. Biker. Oh, yeah, I read the rest of your stuff there, Biker. Susul, okay, thanks. Biker says, yes, that's exactly it. Thanks. We have AWS Elastic Beanstalk that spins up a bunch of little VMs, each as an application front end. Okay, yeah, cool. Danny, is the stream buffering for anyone else? A bit choppy. Well, hopefully the buffering is okay now. I'm not getting any stream alerts from YouTube, so hopefully it's good. And I see green, so if it's not good, let me know. You're welcome, Antonio. Thiago, thanks for answering your question. You're welcome. Alex, yeah, no, Infrakit. Yeah, that is, I'm sad too. I'm very sad, especially because it was it had the potential to really solve a lot of problems, specifically for Swarm, obviously, just for Swarm. But yeah, that the gentleman that was running that is actually moved on to running another team at Docker, and I think they're kind of unofficially shelving it to see if maybe, but the community can pick it up actually. So hopefully the community will keep it alive and keep it moving forward. And Biker says, yes, thanks. So I think I have actually caught up all with the live chat. So now is your time, if you just showed up, to ask a question, because I am all caught up and I'm ready to jump on the next hard problem. While I'm waiting for your questions, let me see if I can't find, let me see if I can't find some info on that Swarm autoscaling. Thought I had a. Is it Orbiter? Yeah, so Orbiter is one of them. I don't know if Alex is still hanging out, but Orbiter is one of them. It's been 6 months since it's had a commit. I don't think it got a lot of love. I tried it when he first launched it, and actually let's yeah. Let's see if oh, interesting. I didn't realize it works with Influx. So it evidently works with Influx for the metrics. So you got to have that metric side and then the orchestration side of spinning things up and down. So this should work. I mean, Swarm hasn't changed in 6 months. So as long as this is a fully working option, I am actually going to check that out. So if we have enough time on here, I might check that out in there. So the other one that I think I've seen, let's see, Autoscale, Swarm. I think Alex, the other Alex, did something. Oh, yeah, okay. Yep. All right, so a couple of things I'm seeing. I had actually forgot about this one. So, all right, so Docker Flow is by another captain, Victor. Does a lot of really cool work here. I have also not tried this one. And it's funny because I keep seeing all of his tools. I'm a big fan of Docker, his Docker Flow proxy, which uses HA proxy and listens to the Swarm API with an agent and basically creates this nice way, kind of like traffic, but it uses HA proxy to auto scale or to auto connect an HTTP layer 7 load balancer and reverse proxy, just like traffic would do, but using the HA proxy engine. And it does it quite well. Anyway, I've used that project of his and I'm an advocate of that. And he has so many other projects in his list of cool things to try. He actually works for the Jenkins company, CloudBees, and has some really cool stuff here. This is one of them. I have not used it, sadly. And most of these are that case where they sound really cool, and then I sit down and I get distracted by the internet, and I never get around to playing with it. So that is another one. And then I know that Alex Ellis has done some simple stuff with Prometheus, Swarm, and Autoscaling. And I don't know. Yeah, so he might have some stuff in here. So I'm going to throw these in there. There's that. That. And the other one is that at DockerCon EU last year, there was, it was called, it was a competition. It was a competition like Chaos Monkey, and what was the name of that session? It was called King Kong versus what's the Terminator movie AI? What's that called? Somebody quick. No, can't figure it out. Duck King Kong. Let's see if I get enough. Oh my goodness. This was a great session. So if I can find it, I will post it. I know that we've got a couple of more questions, but Skynet, look, there you go. I think it's King Kong versus Skynet. No, is it King Kong versus Skynet? Or maybe it's Godzilla versus Skynet. Oh. No. No, I'm not finding it. All right, I'm gonna have to find this then. Anyway, this was one of those cool sessions where they did live battle testing against a swarm, and Infrakit was the way they tried to keep it alive. And go here. Boom. Planet of the Apes. That's what it is. Not King Kong. I was so wrong. All right. Here we go. That particular DockerCon video is, it's a neat, fun little game they played basically where they dueled the AI of Chaos Monkey, sorry, kind of thing against Infrakit. And ultimately, I think Swarm lost. I think the Planet of the Apes won. Skynet, which would be the Infrakit Swarm thing, lost. But that's fun. That's always a fun show to see if you can set up a bunch of infrastructure and kill it and watch it try to survive that attack. But anyway, so there's some options for Alex if he's still around. Biker is back. A bit concerned about session stickiness. It does not seem to be part of Swarm. If a user starts a session in one replica, there is no way to lock them into the same replica on subsequent calls. Biker, that is not true. It is just not obvious. It's not a Swarm feature, because Swarm doesn't speak HTTP, right? Swarm, the load balancing, the ingress networking is all at layer 4. So it doesn't understand the higher level protocols. So that's up to you. That's why you would need to do something like Traffic. But if you use Docker Flow Proxy or Traffic, all those offer session stickiness. You just have to enable it. It's usually just a little option. And the way that usually works is that those containers will route the traffic. Those containers will maintain stickiness, right? So they'll be aware of incoming traffic and keep that traffic on that node. And then they will send it to the same backend container. And usually they do that by skipping the virtual IP or the VIP, which is another hop in the middle if you know Docker networking and Swarm. It'll skip that and go directly to the container, which you can get at through DNS. And you can just basically have a list of all the containers. So those Traffic or Docker Flow Proxy will keep track of all those and send it to the right one at the right time. I have tested it. It does work. So yes, you can do session stickiness just like that. And that's whether or not you're using the ingress networking. You don't have to use host networking in order to get that option for session stickiness. It's just not, since there are no built-in HTTP load balancers, you don't see that in the documentation or in any of the commands in Docker. You have to go looking up like, like in Docker Flow Proxy, you go in the documentation and you search sticky. Maybe it's not on this page. Maybe it's usage. Yeah, so in here, it's a little small on my screen, but in sticky. So you could enable stickiness on a particular endpoint for HTTP coming in on the Docker Flow Proxy, which uses HA proxy. If you're in Traffic, I know there's a way to do it in Traffic as well. Yeah. And so that's going to be an option that you'll put in your config in your compose file. And in fact, in my dog versus cat repo, is that over here? Yeah. In this repo, dog versus cat, I don't think I do anything sticky yet, but that's a great example. For my demos here is I don't think I have anything in here for sticky yet. Yeah, so I should make a new issue here. So yeah, that would be a good addition for me to put in there. So great idea. Thank you. I will do that.
Your audio is way out of sync with your video.
Really?
Do you want to see?
Yeah. So that's going to be an option that you'll put in your config in your. So I'm learning that my audio and video are out of sync. Is it like seconds?
I can't even tell.
Okay.
Ask if they're experiencing.
So I don't know if anyone's noticing my audio and video are out of sync, but that sucks. All right, so what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to stop and restart the stream, and that should fix it. And so it will basically, the screen will stop and flip. So I'll be back in a second. And we should be back. Hopefully the audio there is fixed. All right, so sorry about that. I'm sometimes with OBS, the audio synchronization gets messed up, and there's no way for me to tell. So, all right. Bit concerned about session sticky. Any solution for that? It guarantees all the requests. Okay, I think I'm up to date with your questions, Biker. AWS Elastic load balancing lets you guarantee that all the requests go to the same front end. Yeah. So yeah, I think I do believe I answered that. Alec, thanks for the Australian friendly time. You are most welcome. That's why I wanted to try one on a separate schedule, because there's some people that just aren't awake at 11 a.m. Eastern on Thursday. So yeah, plus it's the evening for me, which means that I get to have a happy hour while we're talking. Let's see. Taylor, yes. Okay, thanks a lot, Taylor. Hopefully that's fixed it. Alex is saying still wonky. That's weird. I will unfortunately have to check that later. Guess it doesn't really matter, does it? Just it's annoying to watch, but it's not anything that's going to impact it. I maybe have to stop my OBS software, but shucks. Every week there's a new random issue. I'm using OBS, Open Broadcasting Software, along with a separate camera and mic. So maybe that's the issue. Is I got a UBS software on here, and then I got a USB mic here, and then I got a USB mic camera over there. I don't know. It always works in my test. It never works when I go live. All right, so moving on. What are you using to broadcast? Clays, yeah, OBS. The latest version, I believe. So that's really free software. And it's a little complicated to get started, but once you get used to it, it works well. And I like it, except for when it doesn't work on times like this. That kind of sucks. So anyone else have any more questions? We have about 5 minutes left for the best questions. I'm trying to think of anything else that anyone has asked that I haven't fully answered. So your last burning questions. Biker says, by the way, best $20 ever spent. I assume that $20 was on my Udemy courses. So yes, thank you. I'm glad you like them, and I have a lot of fun making them and supporting them. In case you are not aware, I have 2 courses and working on the 3rd and 4th. Those are at, you can get the best coupons for those to get them for $10 at brettfisher.com. They are listed at the top there, and they're always on sale, so you can always get them for $10. And those coupons are usually the cheapest you can get around. And then on that page are a bunch of my other videos. I'm putting more videos up here on YouTube, so you'll see more stuff here. If you are a subscriber to my channel on YouTube, you just click that subscribe button. I'm putting more up here as well as these weekly AMAs. And do I have a corporate rate? The corporate rate is $10. The individual rate is $10. If you are a person on Udemy, if you didn't know, when you sign into Udemy, they actually offer you now a business subscription, so your company can buy the top like 5,000 courses for a monthly rate for all the engineers. So there's a lot of other content on there for DevOps. So I encourage you to convince your boss to get you that subscription. But I don't think you can get that as an individual. You have to get that as a company. But other than that, I can't even make the courses cheaper than $10. So there's no way for me to sell it in a bulk discount that way. So next course should be how to run a great Udemy course. Honestly, be yourself, put yourself on camera, and the third thing would be practice and then practice and then practice. Because I for every hour of content I put on the internet, I probably spent, my wife and I and our team probably spent 40 hours making it. So it's not an easy thing to be able to make a quality course. The solution to the session stickiness issue, what was that again for Clay? Okay, so not sure how much you heard of the conversation. We're talking about Swarm. And in Swarm, if you have, let's say you have 3 nodes, and let's say all the traffic is going to the first node because you have a front-end load balancer, like an ELB or something that's sending someone's traffic to that node. That node will, based on the default ingress networking and everything of Swarm, it will send the traffic. Every new connection will go to a different node, right? It's load balancing across the different replicas of that service. So if you are someone who needs session stickiness in a web app, the first thing is you need traffic or something that speaks HTTP, a layer 7 reverse proxy. So the 2 that I mentioned here were Docker Flow Proxy. I will put that link here. Docker Flow Proxy. And then traffic, probably the more popular one because it is not, I'll actually put the link straight to that stuff. But basically, by default, these aren't going to make sure that you have sticky state. And really, stickiness, generally, I try to avoid it, right? If you have apps that need stickiness, there is another way to deal with stickiness by taking your session state and moving that to a backend solution. I don't know, Memcache, MySQL, Redis, something that shares the session state so that you don't have in-memory sessions for your app. So that's an app architecture question that's more about distributed computing, not really about containers. But in a typical orchestrator, you are going to need to put in this proxy in it that will speak HTTP reverse proxy. And you maybe knew all that, but maybe I was just realizing that maybe some in the audience didn't know the actual problem of sticky sessions. That the minute you have an application running on multiple servers and running a website or an API or something, if you expect people to go to the specific instance that they were connected to, like they logged into that, for example, that's a sticky session problem, or that's the common name for that general problem. And in general, I would say go to your app. If you develop the app yourself, or if you have control of the app, look at any options for getting the session state out of that application and into a shared store, so that all of your servers that are running that app can share the sessions, and so that any node can then connect that user. Because fundamentally, if you're using if a user is connected to one of your apps and it has to talk to that specific container because that one has their session in memory, you are already sort of breaking some of the fundamental ideas around distributed computing, which is you shouldn't have to care which node or which version or copy of the app they're using. They should be able to hop amongst nodes. And I know that we can't always do this, right? WebSockets is, I think, one of the harder problems to solve. But if you're just dealing with HTTP, you can usually find out that your app allows a backend database or some other solution off container that would solve that problem so that they could hop between nodes and it wouldn't matter and their session would be fine. I generally try to go that route. Yeah, like Memcache, like Clay's mentioning. etcd, yeah, whatever, those kinds of things. If you can do that, I always recommend that, because fundamentally, if you are fixed on that one container for that user, that means that that container has to get replaced, updated, if it has a problem, if the node itself has a problem and has to move that container. For any of those problems in an orchestrator, that user just got logged out or lost their session or lost whatever it was that was that session. And that's a problem in a world where we're trying to update things every day or every hour or whatever, right? Your deployment schedule is. So if you can't gracefully move them from one thing to another because of that sticky session state thing, you've got a more fundamental issue in your app. And I know that not all apps can solve this problem, and maybe you're just running some off-the-shelf software that only uses in-memory. For example, my Ghost blog. Here's a great example. My Ghost blog, the Ghost team has decided to not try to solve multi-server persistence or session state or anything like that in these first couple of releases. And they do a great job. It's great open source. I love their blog engine. So I'm not knocking them for this, but they just kind of said, well, you know what? We expect you to put a bunch of caches and, CDNs in front of this solution. So I'm running a 3-node swarm here for this website, but I'm only running one container of the Ghost engine because it doesn't support any shared session backend. It only supports the one container running at a time for one website. Now, the only real issue for that is for me running the backend. It's not really like you going to the website. There's no cookies. There's no session there. I work hard to make sure there's no sessions there because it's just a blog. There's no reason for me to track you or anything. So I don't have sessions there that I care about. So I could potentially run a bunch of websites on different containers, but if I log into the backend and then suddenly my session flips to a new host, my session state of me logging in to that backend wouldn't be kept. And the Ghost team has basically said, we look at it as you should cache everything in this app on the front end, and that way if it goes down, you actually have CDN and caching that's going to keep the whole website up, and that the real Ghost node app that's running in the background is really just there for administration purposes, and doesn't need to be scaled for capacity reasons beyond one node. So that's an interesting approach they took. It means that for me, I can run a 3-node swarm and only have to run one container for the whole website, and then I put traffic in front of it, and I put a CDN in front of that so that I have all the caching and everything to work. So I don't have to solve it with session state. So anyway, yeah. Is AWS Fargate or ECS same as Swarm? Hey, Mohammed. Same as in they're solving all the same problems in general. Yes, they're all just orchestrators. Swarm, Kubernetes upstream, raw, AWS, ECS. Those are all EKS, AKS from Azure. Now there's Kubernetes on Docker, on DigitalOcean. DigitalOcean is now in beta testing for their own Kubernetes. Those are all just solving the same orchestration problem, which is running multiple containers on multiple servers in a fashion where the system itself organizes where they go, right? I'm not sure if what your question is specifically on, but in general, each one of those products has their own features and functionality. Some of them are cheap, some of them are more expensive. The cheaper ones tend to mean that you have to run the stuff. If they're more expensive, like maybe Fargate, then that means that they're managing more of it for you. So it's easier for you, but also more expensive for you. And that's, like if you look at something like Docker Enterprise Edition, that's you pay per node to run that, but it means that you can also run your orchestrator, whether it's Swarm or Kubernetes, you can run that on Azure and Amazon and DigitalOcean. I mean, you can run it, in a bunch of different places and maintain it with one tool. Or you could do that with Rancher, for example. Rancher could run your Kubernetes on those different places. So there's lots of different ways to run an orchestrator, especially Kubernetes, which has lots of variants, or as I would call them, distributions. The same way you have lots of distributions of Linux, right? So we all don't want the same Linux. We all like different variants or distributions of Linux. Kubernetes has taken that approach, and they now have lots of different distributions or ways that you can use them. And they all have their own pros and cons and different levels of feature set and supportability and scalability. So it's a little hard to tell you all the different nuances of each one because there's so much stuff there. But hopefully that helps you. Taylor's here. And is your setup mapped out so we can study it? Goes in one container with caching, etc. So Taylor, yes. Most of it is in here in a repo called dog versus cat. I will put that in there. See, Alec says work is calling. So sorry about that. You can hopefully push pause and then come back later and keep playing it. So we'll ask a few more. We'll have a few more questions, and I'm going to wrap it up for today. But this dog versus cat is not everything that I've done. So there's different levels of stuff going on here, right? So this repo is based on a talk I gave at DockerCon on how a single DevOps person or even a part-time DevOps person might run an orchestrator in production with all the bells and whistles. This is sort of a work in progress. So I have, this was all done mostly for June's DockerCon here in the US. I'll be doing this again in December, I think, technically the beginning of December in Barcelona for DockerCon EU. And I will have more stuff in it for that. You guys have actually given me some ideas today. So I might do look at some auto-scaling. I don't have anything in here for your specific question on caching. I use a CDN for that. I use Cloudflare. And Cloudflare is it's sort of a cheat, right? I'm not running my own. Cloudflare is a free tool. I actually pay a few dollars for it, but you can use it for free. That it will basically front in your website and cache everything and make it faster with CDNs all around the world and give you SSL. I do SSL inside this example. You can actually find examples in there of how to do SSL with Let's Encrypt and traffic, but it doesn't technically do caching or CDN stuff yet, not out of the box. So that would maybe be an improvement. And if you'd like to see stuff in this app that is specifically to Swarm and how to deploy Swarm with all the bells and whistles that you might need, feel free to throw those in as an idea in the issues. Just go in there and make a new GitHub issue, throw it in as a feature request, and let's talk about it because obviously I'd love your help. I mean, this is open source. I'd love your commits. But also, I I'm interested in what things you need, because this solution is largely about helping the community use a simple orchestrator to solve problems that otherwise may be much more complex to do if you chose something else instead of Swarm. So yeah, so let's see. Last couple of questions here. Mohammed, you're most welcome. Clay, what K8 distro do you use? Do you use Flavor? I think you mean do you use, but I think I know what you mean. Okay, so Kubernetes. I have used Kubernetes in Docker Enterprise Edition. So if you're a paid enterprise customer and you believe in the sort of the Docker happy path of everything working well locally and then making it easier to deploy to production, I think Docker EE is a great tool for that. Rancher, I'm a fan of that simply because Rancher allows you, it's free. You can get paid support from them. So, but the product itself is free, and Rancher allows you to set up a Kubernetes cluster without having to be an expert on how to set it up. It solves some of the problems for the complexity of deployment and management. And so I'm a fan of that. I'm not a fan of people that are maybe one or two people deep in their DevOps team taking a new Kubernetes upstream pure deployment. And what I mean by Kubernetes upstream, that means by like going over to Kubernetes on GitHub and actually like cloning the repo, and not that you can actually do it this way anyway, but downloading the tools like kubadmin and kubectl and deploying it that way, just because that's a great learning tool, but that's a really, really hard way to do it for production, because there's a lot of moving pieces there, and it's a lot of work for one or two people to manage all that. So in fact, the team that made Kubernetes publicly has stated many times that they did not intend for Kubernetes to be used raw out of the box by server people, by server DevOps people or developers. It's meant for higher level tools to be on top of that. If you're on Amazon, obviously I would recommend using Amazon's tools. If you're trying to do things with CloudFormation and all of the Amazon tooling, I would support using their EKS out of the box and doing it their way, because that's the advantage of using them as a cloud provider. AKS over on Azure. I haven't yet tried DigitalOcean's Kubernetes, but I am in the beta. I just haven't had a chance to play with it. So I would always use the clouds first if they have something, assuming that there's not a really bad reason for that. I don't really have any bad reasons for not using theirs. And then I would try to use something like Rancher or Docker EE. The last option I would give you is to do it yourself. If you're not aware, if you're on Docker for Windows or Docker for Mac, those tools, which are now called Docker Desktop in general, Docker Desktop, that has Kubernetes built in, right? You can actually go in and set up a mini little Kubernetes environment to play with by just going in the settings there. And this now works on stable or edge releases. Either one works, and you can enable Kubernetes that way. I just had mine actually turned off today because I was trying to save battery. Kubernetes can sometimes really kill your battery. But yeah, so check that out, and hopefully that will help you with your flavor questions. Biker says, I found Azure AKS to be a bit unstable. It is a moving target as they are evolving quickly. That didn't have Docker Windows until a short while ago, and Azure File Storage is HDD, not only. Yeah, so that's great info, Biker. That is an example of how both of those are very new tools, right? Like Kubernetes itself is a very fast-moving infrastructure. It's more like what Docker was like 3 years ago. Docker was pretty fast-moving 3 and 4 years ago, but now it's feature release is slowed, it's matured, it's more stable now, and they're really focused on quality and all that stuff. Kubernetes is not that, right? Kubernetes is still, I think, a very leading edge, if not bleeding edge technology that changes with lots of changes and breaking changes even with each version. And so it's going to be, I'm looking forward to the day when it's nice and stable and I don't have to read the release notes and fine print to figure out what's not working this time versus last time. The other challenge with Kubernetes is you have lots of choice. And that's a great thing for choice, but that's a hard thing for consistency. So if your networking is going to be different on each one of those infrastructures and how that networking works and the subtleties of that. So yeah, it's a lot more to deal with in terms of learning the different parts of that tool and what things work and what things don't. But that's some great info. I did not know that about the HDD only on Azure because I haven't paid attention there. Yeah, AKS also ties into Azure AD, which is always a struggle in the corporate world. Yeah, Azure AD, I haven't played with Azure AD in a couple of years, but I used to actually have a full-time job working on things like Azure AD and Windows stuff. So that was about 10 years ago. But yeah, Azure AD, cool stuff. Do you have a subscription listed to be notified of future events like this one? And thank you for doing this. Hi, Norman. Yes, if you subscribe and click the bell in this YouTube channel, you will get notified of any future YouTube videos as well as any of the live stuff. If you want to be on my newsletter, I don't send out my newsletter for this live video because I figure you're probably on YouTube, and if you're subscribing to me on YouTube, you're going to get that notification. But if you're on my website at brettfisher.com, there is a newsletter button there. I will announce all new blog posts, all new courses, anything related to DevOps is all going into that newsletter. It is not weekly, so if you go a couple of weeks and you don't see anything, don't worry. It's only when I feel like there's really good stuff to put out there. Let's see. Okay, so we're a little bit past our hour, but we've got some good questions, so I'm going to keep going. Do you have a thoughts on KubeSpray, Clay, KubeSpray? That is a great tool. I don't have a strong opinion. There's a couple of other ones out there. You got KOps coming out, right? There's a list actually that I've been formulating, right? We've got, no, that's not it. Cluster setup. Just realized I misspelled that. Kubicorn is another one, KubeSpawn. So I don't really have an opinion on which one is the best because I really haven't used them all that much. Because I'm generally not, again, I'm not deploying my own, other than for learning and playing around with things, I'm not deploying raw Kubernetes infrastructure. I prefer to have a higher level tool on top of that that's doing that job for me. Whether that's a tool from one of the clouds or that's a Rancher or that's Docker Enterprise Edition or something like that. Usually the burden of making sure I get all those pieces of the puzzle right is too much for me to want to do as an individual. And part of what I do with teams is I'm training them so that they can do their own thing, right? I'm not a permanent part of their team. So I don't want to give them so much new stuff out of the gate that like they, you've got to learn how to do all this RBAC setup and then the networking, and you got to choose that thing, and then you got to choose your persistent storage option, and like maybe there's just so much new there that I tend to try to keep it simple at first, and that usually has me leaning towards a provided offering, not raw Kubernetes upstream. But I also don't work with teams of 50 DevOps engineers, right, or even 25 DevOps engineers. I'm usually working with teams of 5 or less people that are focused on infrastructure full time. Trying to do the DevOps work, the continuous deployment work, and stuff like that. Usually it's a team of like 2 or 3, because that usually is the team that's supporting 30, 40, 50 developers. They usually get like 1 or 2 or 3 people to manage all the infrastructure. And usually for them to hand build all this stuff, even when they're using a tool like KubeSpray, is still a little too much effort for them to do in a fault tolerant and secure way. And that's really my requirement for production, is fully locked down, networking segmentation, all the bells and whistles, monitoring, logging, centralized, yada, 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 right? So for them to do all of that is a lot. Persistent storage. Brett, what is your recommendation, native in Docker or a third party, for apps with a lot of I/O requirements that is deployed in a multi-node Swarm cluster? My recommendation for apps with a lot of I/O requirements that is deployed in a multi-node Swarm cluster. So do you know about RexRay? It's a great question, Clay. Sorry, I just don't have any specific thoughts on KubeSpray. In fact, I'm not even sure the last time I used it. I think the last one I tried to play with was Kubicorn, and KubeAdmin and stuff like that. Nowadays, lately, the focus I have had over the summer, if you're a Docker-focused person, and I'm getting back to this, I'll get back to the storage question in a second, is DCI, Docker's certified infrastructure tooling. So, So Docker now has a set of tools that, because Docker Enterprise Edition sets up Docker for you and deploys Kubernetes for you. It's really easy. It's push button stuff. So Docker, I don't know why this page is not coming up. So Docker themselves have put together a toolkit using open source tools to build the infrastructure for you that you would then install Docker EE on. And in this case, they're using well, I think they list it, but Terraform and Ansible. And those are actually part of my, let me get back over to it, my dog versus cat. So if you're looking in there, you'll see that there is something called DCI AWS, and that is me working with Docker's new tooling called the DCI, or Docker Certified Infrastructure, to try to get it to work properly on AWS without building out clusters for UCP and DTR. That's the Docker Enterprise Edition stuff, using their Terraform and Ansible scripts and that automation that they're building in there. So that's technically more than what a kubespray would do, or a kubicorn or whatever. And so theirs is a 1.0 release, which means it's not perfect. And I was working on that over the summer to get that going. So that's the thing that I've been playing with a lot lately as a part of my dog versus cat demo stuff. Back to RexRay. So RexRay in general for Swarm is the way that you get Swarm engines nodes to talk to storage off the node. So I would say using RexRay, or the other one I would say is, and I'm going to forget the name. And this will be the last question, but this is a great question because storage is always a topic that everybody brings up. Under storage, we will do Portworx. So Portworx is a commercial offering that is a paid offering. It works. You can use a developer version for free on 3 nodes, but if you need more than that, you have to pay for it. And it actually does data replication as well as other things. So it's a little bit like a Gluster FS or a Ceph. But RexRay isn't a storage replication engine. RexRay is a storage orchestrator. So it acts as a middle layer between whatever storage you eventually want to use. Maybe that's Elastic Block Storage in AWS, or EFS, or NFS, or DigitalOcean's block storage, or maybe you have your own NFS servers in-house, or your own iSCSI servers, or some proprietary servers that are storing all of your data and providing data as a service there. RexRay sits in the middle and acts as the volume driver and tells the containers in your swarm where to go get their storage from when they launch on a specific node. So, for example, if I had a service with 3 tasks in it, I had a 3 replica service, and I do that in this, over here in dog versus cat, I first install the RexRay volume driver, and I tell it to use DigitalOcean's block storage as the backend for the storage. And I do that in this simple little YAML file here, and this actually goes in the background and installs uses something called Swarm exec, which I talk about in that video, and it installs the driver for the volume driver for RexRay, specifically for DigitalOcean. And then when I'm inside of my app, I tell the app to use that volume driver. So maybe here. So I'm deploying Ghost, and I'm telling it to use a volume with this specific driver. And that's it. So instead of it using the default driver, which is local, it will use the RexRay driver for that storage. And so RexRay's job is to go get that storage, create the volume if it's needed to be created on that storage, connect it to the node, and get the container connected to it all in one shot. If it works like it's supposed to, that all works, and it works great. It doesn't always work because it's open source and there's edge cases. Actually, I just found out the other day, one of the students mentioned that there's a bug in the DigitalOcean one where reconnecting to a node over and over again, I guess, doesn't always work. I haven't had that issue in my clusters on DigitalOcean, but they were saying that was a known bug. So you got to test things, obviously. Portworx is a little more enterprise-y focused and more high-end. Like if you're going serious, true production for a business that makes money that you're doing on Swarm, then I would look at something like Portworx. There's other things out there like Gluster and Ceph, but stuff like that. But getting them to work in Swarm requires maybe extra effort and a little more manual labor because they maybe don't have a native Swarm plugin. So, but I would look at RexRay first, especially if you're doing cloud stuff. DigitalOcean block storage can only connect to one node at a time. Yes, Joshua. Hi, Joshua. By the way, I didn't see you there earlier. Most storage by default can only talk to one node at a time. There are only a few storage options that can do multi-node connections to the same storage. That's usually reserved for NFS or Windows NTFS file shares. That's usually the realm of that, or something that's maybe HTTP based, or something like S3 obviously can do it. But most storage backends are not designed for multi-host connectivity. Being a sysadmin for a living, that's actually kind of an assumed default, and I sometimes forget that that's not an obvious thing in a cluster, is that you have a bunch of nodes and you can't just connect the same volume to all of them usually. So you need to look at your storage provider and what the feature set they have and figure out, I know you know this, Joshua, I'm just telling this for everybody else, that your storage driver and the storage provider itself is really what's going to decide for you the functionality, the performance, whether you can read write to multi-node. Some of them will allow you to do multi-node, but only one node can read write. Some nodes can then read only. Some can do multi-node read write. That is not actually a container thing. That's just a distributed computing issue. Back in the day when we would do fiber channel and iSCSI stuff, you'd have to get special storage and special setups. You'd have to do like NTFS4, which was the latest thing, in order to allow multi-nodes to write to the same directories and the same storage. So it's a harder problem. Yeah. And Azure can do that, and with a couple of their drivers. I don't know that all their storage does that, but maybe you know better than I do. But like file shares out of the box do that, like NFS and Windows NTFS, SMB file shares, stuff like that. But yeah, that's a great point to make, that you just don't assume out of the box that everything's going to be able to share. And that's a thing about storage, is that there's no automatic replication. There's no automatic file sharing across nodes. That is a just general distributed computing problem. Portworx and other things like Gluster and Ceph will replicate data across nodes if you set them up properly, and they'll create a little storage location. But you can't do that as you can't do all that stuff as a replacement for database redundancy. You can't replicate a database across nodes safely with a storage engine like Portworx or Gluster or something. They replicate files that are like maybe images or static assets. But generally for multi-node replication, that's the kind of thing you're going to replicate, not a database. A database, you're going to have to set up database mirroring and replication that way, which is a whole other conversation that we'll leave for next week, if you come back. We'll talk about database replication and clusters, because orchestration does not solve your database problems. It just provides you an easier way to do it, but it doesn't mean that you don't need clusters of databases. You usually need those as well. If you're going to do MySQL or Postgres or Microsoft SQL or anything like that, you're going to need to do in production multi-node database clusters, regardless of which orchestration or which tool you use, if you want true high availability with failover. Anyway, so I'm going to wrap it up. Let's see what the last few things here are. Taylor says, Kubernetes has Helm. Does Docker Swarm have something analogous to it? Docker Swarm Compose. It's like, Taylor, you were there to get me to brag about some new tool. It's like I snuck you in at the last second. Yes, it's not necessarily Helm, but there are two things you can look at. Because Helm is awesome, right? Helm's got a GUI. It's got a whole website. Docker has a new thing for Helm. In case you all are not aware, Helm is kind of like the fancy version of Docker Compose for Kubernetes. And on the Docker side, they have something now called Docker App. So there's two things going on here on the Docker side. You have, obviously, the Compose file, which is in a Swarm, the Swarm stack file. It's the same thing. But getting that file around and having a central repository and all that is not yet a thing like we have with Helm. So what you can do is, this is a brand new tool that just came out at DockerCon, and so it's sort of in a beta pre-release phase. This tool allows you to ship around Compose files with a new layer of environment variables for making it easier to work in teams. And then it allows you to actually deploy those Compose files as a Helm chart. So it'll convert into Helm in case you have Compose and you want Helm. It will also let you package up that Compose file in an image store it on Docker Hub, and then ship it around your team like an asset, like you would a Helm chart or a Docker image for your app. So it's really cool. It doesn't necessarily put the compose file in your app. It ships it as a separate image, and it controls it separately so that you can treat it like an artifact, that you can version it. You can version your compose files now finally, and you can ship those around. I'm going to do videos on this sometime soon, and it'll also be added to my courses at some point once the standard is formalized. But it's a really cool concept. I'm a big fan of it, which basically means now that if we all got started using these tools, this would mean Docker Hub would be the place to go look for compose files like you would go to Helm to look for Helm charts. So that's the closest thing I've seen to it. There have been a few places on the internet where people, like you look at Portainer. If you look at Portainer is the GUI for Swarm. It's a great GUI. I think it's probably the best one out there other than Docker EE. Portainer has built in their own little version of compose-like Helm stuff. So they have their own list of apps that you can deploy on the Portainer with a sort of a point-and-click deployment with Compose. That's built into Portainer, though. It's only for Portainer. It doesn't work on anything outside of Portainer that I'm aware of. So go check that out. There are a couple of other efforts that have been to use Compose files in a central repository, but none of them have stuck. I haven't seen any that really stuck with that. But I'm so glad you asked that question. And I'm going to answer the rest of your stuff in text because we're out of time and I'm losing my voice. So thanks for coming again. Again, reminder to check out my stuff at brettfisher.com/Docker. That will get you all the resources that I mentioned about here, and all of my courses and all my stuff. And then sign up for the newsletter to get future announcements about anything I'm releasing. And then click subscribe and the little bell button on this video to get notified whenever I go live next week, because we'll be back here next week. And thanks for coming. Talk to you next time.